Joe, if you can hear me, are you in a place where you can lead us in prayer in a minute?
Did you speak to me, Andrew?
Yeah, are you in a place where you can lead us in prayer in a minute?
Well, I'm sitting here. I guess I can.
All right, thank you.
All right.
Give people a couple more minutes. If you want to go ahead and turn over to Matthew 16, that's where we're going to pick up tonight. Matthew chapter 16. On Sunday, we covered a lot of ground pretty quickly. I know that was a lot of things to throw out there at once, both as we looked ahead to the rest of Matthew's document, but then also surveyed through several things um, after we saw the parables in chapter 13. And so we left off talking about Jesus' statement to the disciples, warning them about the leavening of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and recognizing the role that the feeding of the 5,000 and the 4,000 played in the point that Jesus was made there, as he tried to get across to them that it wasn't the physical bread of this world that he was concerned about, because he could make that appear from practically nothing, right? But it was the bread of their teaching, the leavening that comes from their teaching, that he was warning them against. And so that's where we left off. I'm going to pick up in the middle of chapter 16 then this evening and walk through Matthew's record of Peter's confession and some of the events that follow after that. So we're going to slow down a bit as we walk through that. We covered this, we looked at this in Mark's gospel, but Matthew gives us a little bit more information, adds some things that helps provide more insight into what Jesus is trying to do here, and also even add some different light into the responses that we see afterwards. And so I want to spend some time actually walking through that, even though we looked at this in Mark, and understand perhaps the role that it plays here in this gospel. And so as we get started, I'd like to read chapter 16, beginning in verse 13 through the first half of 17, and then after that, Joe will lead us in prayer. Matthew 16, beginning in verse 13. Now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter replied, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." And he strictly charged the disciples to tell no one that he was the Christ. From that time Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, "Far be it from you, Lord, this shall never happen to you." But he turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." Then Jesus told his disciples, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? Or what shall a man give in return for his soul? For the Son of Man is going to come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and then he will repay each person according to what he has done. Truly I say to you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." And after 6 days Jesus took with him Peter and James and John his brother, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as light. And behold, there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with him. And Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good that we are here. If you wish, I will make 3 tents here, one for you, and one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He was still speaking when, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell on their faces and were terrified. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, "Rise and have no fear." And when they lifted up their eyes, they saw no one but Jesus only. And as they were coming down the mountain, Jesus commanded them, "Tell no one the vision until the Son of Man is raised from the dead." And the disciples asked him, "Then why do the scribes say that Elijah first must come?" He answered, "Elijah does come, and he will restore all things. But I tell you that Elijah has already come, and they did not recognize him, but did to him whatever they pleased. So also the Son of Man will certainly suffer at their hands." Then the disciples understood that he was speaking to them of John the Baptist. Joe, please.
Let's go to God in prayer. Dear God, we come before you in prayer. We give you praise. You truly are a great and wonderful God. We thank you for your goodness and all the good things that you do provide for us. Dear God, we live in a troubled time, and there's so many things in this world that will distract us from the true kingdom and draw us away. Satan uses all these things against us, but give us the courage to look to your word. And we're so thankful, dear God, for men like Andrew who are leading our Bible studies and have good knowledge, and they give us, help us understand the things that's therein. Bless them, dear God, as only you can. Be with all of us, God, and touch our hearts. Make it moldable, that these words will have an impact on us and change us and help us proclaim your kingdom, the only place that we can go to for truth and justice. Be with us, dear God. We pray in Jesus. Amen.
Hey, thanks, Joe. So on Sunday, one of the things that we mentioned is that in this latter section of Matthew's document, that there's a lot of kind of overlapping things that are going on and overlapping threads as Jesus has explained the kingdom, given parables about the nature of the kingdom and expectations that people have of it. He's talked about how people are going to react differently to it, and even the division that it will cause as he sent out his disciples. And of course, we began with kind of, as is often described, the constitution of the kingdom in the Sermon on the Mount. And hopefully we've seen how that lesson and the teachings of it continue to come up in Matthew's gospel, and we'll continue to see that perhaps even tonight more as we look at that. But what we're seeing in this middle section, I think at least one of the things that is really kind of coming into focus is this question of faith on the part of those who are hearing now, and seeing that difference and that distinction, and how Jesus is trying to foster the development of that faith, but also calling out where it's coming up short, even on the part of his disciples. If you think back to chapter 14, when Jesus fed the 5,000, there it kind of, you could say in some ways, you start to see this here as the instruction is given to feed them. The disciples want to send them away, and Jesus says, in verse 16, they don't need to go away. You give something to them. And the apostles look up at this, or the disciples look up at this, and they're like, how can we do this? And of course, Jesus responds to their disbelief with this display of feeding all of these people. And then you see then immediately after that, this example or this account of the faith of Peter, and then the shortcomings of that faith. When Jesus is walking on the water in the midst of the storm, he has the faith to step out of the boat, but then ultimately loses sight of that faith when he sees the storm, and Jesus says to him, "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And as we continue through some of these examples, that idea keeps coming up again. In chapter 15, it's now the faith of this Gentile woman who comes to the forefront, and Jesus responds favorably to her because of the faith that she has had, and even points out, that great is her faith, and calls out, in some ways how it's different from those that were around. And then you see the feeding of the 4,000, and here again, Jesus is responding to his disciples. He's saying, "Don't send them away. Let's feed them." They're asking, "Where are we going to get enough of this?" And he responds to them, how many do you have? And he takes care of it. And then that progresses back to another kind of contrary example with the Pharisees and the Sadducees, where they're asking for the sign. And we talked about this at the end of class on Sunday, where they're asking for a sign, and Jesus says, I'm not going to give you the sign that you're asking for. But those who would look would understand what was going on. And even though he doesn't use the word faith, right, they would, by implication, be able to see the things that were going on and have faith in what is developing. And then in the following example that we ended class with on Sunday, Jesus again calls out the faith of his disciples when he starts talking about the leavening, and they think he's talking about physical bread. But in fact, he's talking about the leavening and the teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees there. And so this section, this is at least one of the themes that kind of comes up, is this idea of faith and how it's developing and where it's short, where it's non-existent, but also where it's strong. And so when we look at this example now, moving on from Jesus' teaching about the leavenings into what we just read in chapter 16, we really see another example of faith in understanding on the part of his disciples. And so as Jesus asks this question about who do you say that I am, or who do people say that I am, we see, of course, the response of the disciples saying, well, people are saying all these different things, right? John or Jeremiah or Elijah. But he points the question to them, and of course Peter responds back and says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And so as he makes that response, what is Jesus's, as Peter makes that confession and shows the faith and the confidence that he has in who Jesus really is, how does Jesus respond to Peter's statement there? And not just thinking about the words, but what really is the thrust of what Jesus is conveying to Peter in those verses there from 17 through 20? What's he getting across to Peter that perhaps Peter didn't even understand at that point in time?
Well, Andrew, this is Josh.
Yeah.
A second. Hi. I'm probably a little bit off with this, but it brings to mind the idea, and we realize, again, we have the rest of the scriptures to know, but it may be pointing to Peter's going to play a very central role in terms of the development of the church, especially, of course, to the Gentiles. And so the idea of helping him to understand that the foundation of, not the foundation, they take that word back. The very initial part of the gospel being spread to other nations would come through Peter. I'll stop there.
Yeah, so he looks at Peter in, the statement of blessed are you, Simon, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, acknowledging that what he recognizes here, what he's discussed, hasn't been revealed by the physical things of this earth, right? But that it's knowledge and understanding that comes from the Father who is in heaven. And it's easy sometimes to read some of these statements and just take them for granted, either because we've read them a lot or not appreciate. But he's, number one, responding to Peter and saying, look, what you understand has been revealed to you from the Father in heaven, right? It's not worldly, earthly bound knowledge, right? This has been revealed to you from the Father in heaven, who is the source of the understanding, the revelation that you've just been heard. And it's on that understanding, right, on this rock, not referring to Peter as the person, but on this confession and on this truth that his church is going to be grounded. And then, as Josh said, the implication to Peter now is this understanding that you have, this faith that you have, is going to lead you to play an instrumental role as this message gets revealed and shared with others. And so you think about the keys in verse 19. What do you do with the key? basic question, right? But what's a key for?
To open,
You
to penetrate the lock, to open. Just like we talked about earlier back in the Sermon on the Mount, salt and light penetrate, and keys penetrate locks.
Right. Yeah. They penetrate locks and they open things up. And if you think about, we've noted in a few places, and there's many places that we could point to about how there's this idea of a mystery that the prophets and the righteous people of the past have been longing to see into, but is now going to be revealed. And so Peter is going to have a key role, not to play on words too much there, but he's going to have a key role in using this key to open this door and unlock these things for a greater group of people. And so whatever he does, whatever he says, is going to be speaking for the kingdom, right? He's going to open these mysteries. He's going to reveal these things for others to hear, for others to respond to, and what he says, he's going to say with the instruction of coming from heaven. And it's not to say that he's going to set the rules, right? That can be misinterpreted. But the point is, you're going to have this role where you're going to speak about the things of heaven, the things that are true, the things that are good, the things that are evil. You're going to have this role in revealing this to others because of the confidence and the faith that you have in this. John?
I'm probably not saying anything new, but there in verse 18 where it says, I will build my church. In the Greek there, it's church singular. It's not plural. There's only one, not many different ones, all teaching different doctrines, but one church.
Right. Yeah, so Peter's confession, in Mark, it's more focused on just the acknowledgement of who Jesus is, right, and the awareness of that. But in Matthew, it helps us understand that this question of faithfulness and how it's been played out is something that continues to be evolving. And so as Jesus sees the faithfulness that Peter does have, he recognizes the role that Peter then is going to play in the revealing of this kingdom. And immediately after that, of course, we're told about how Jesus is revealing now that this awareness, this understanding is out there in the open, he's focusing now on what's going to happen with him. It's not just focused solely on his authority and his identity as the Christ, the Son of God. Now he's adding this instruction, which will be repeated several times, about what actually has to happen to him. And so we see, of course, Peter's response to that is to tell Jesus, no, this can't happen to you. Far be it from you, Lord. And of course, we see Jesus's rebuke of Peter's statement. You're Satan, you're a hindrance, get behind me. And I want to come back to that statement here in just a second. But what I want us just to stop and think about is appreciate what Jesus said to Peter in the first part of this, knowing, as he would have, what Peter still lacked in understanding, right? And just stop and appreciate that about God, about his Son and how he works. Peter's got a faith, right? A faith and a confidence to declare, you are the Christ, the Son of God. But yet his understanding is still lacking in many respects, right? To the extent that he doesn't even appreciate what Jesus needs to do, something that had been foretold throughout Scripture up to this point in time. But yet Jesus still saw Peter in a favorable light when he made that confession and spoke to him of the role that he was going to play. He wasn't perfect. He didn't understand it all. But Jesus could see the faith that he had and the role that he could play and the impact that he could have. And so he tells Peter, blessed, even though he's going to, shortly there turn around and make this connection to the things that he's saying in Satan. He can still see the good and the faithfulness in Peter and respond to that, even though he has this failure of understanding that's going to be revealed. And we talked a little bit about this on Sunday when we looked at the walking on the water and Jesus and Peter stepping out of the boat. And, I just think it is worth repeating, right? To appreciate, it's easy to look at Peter and see all of his failures, right? But the reason we see his failures is because of his passion to get out and put himself there, and his passion to reach out to the Christ and build this relationship and try to follow closely with him. And I just think it's worth appreciating how God can respond, how Jesus can respond favorably to the overall picture that he sees of Peter, even as he sees Peter's own shortcomings in different actions, and in this case, even in his own understanding. Let me pause there. Other observations you want to share on this?
This is Joe. I truly appreciate Peter. I mean, I'm so glad we have him because he was a passionate man. He truly loved God and he loved Jesus, but he lacked full understanding. He saw this case right here, a man's view. Man's view, no, we don't want you to go to the cross. We don't want you to do that. I mean, and he loved Jesus. He did, uh, he wanted this. He didn't have the full understanding. But what's so good for us, we see a man
Maybe
with
that.
passion and care for God, that Peter had, and the love for Jesus, that he was imperfect, but we see his growth, and we see him grow through the Gospels. And even after Pentecost and going, Paul had to get on to him because he was tangled up with the Jew and the Gentile thing there. But Peter, and then he wrote his epistles, and what a wonderful epistles they are. They're grounded in truth, and they tell you and set you forth in a way that he said you won't fall if you do these things. And so we got a man that we can appreciate and see the growth that he went through and give us hope, because I know my Christian walk has been tangled up and messed up. And I see Peter's growth, and if everybody was perfect, I would feel that there's no chance for me. But with Peter, I see that there is a chance for growth and get back up and dust myself off and keep trying. That's all I got.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you read through those statements where Jesus talks about their lack of faith or their little faith, or comes in kind of pointing out their shortcomings, but yet we appreciate the larger perspective that Jesus has on those who are following him, and what we seek to emulate. While we always want to make correction, right? In some senses, we say we don't want to be like Peter. We don't want to be out on the edge and on some of these things. But again, appreciating it's the passion and the commitment that he has for God that leads him to be in these situations in the first place. And we see how Christ responds to him in kind, recognizing his commitment, even in spite of his shortcomings and failures.
Hey, Andrew, I do want to add that Jesus knew who he was talking to here, and he knew that this would cause growth in Peter. Some people, a rebuke like that would almost devastate you.
Yeah.
But he knew that Peter could handle this, and this would help give him growth, that he would open his eyes and see.
Yeah, exactly. Other thoughts?
This all happened on the day of Pentecost.
Yeah, the role that Peter was to play in unlocking the door and sharing the mystery, absolutely, was the role that he played after Jesus ascended and the Spirit came and they began delivering this message. That's right. So I want to look at the statement here in verse 23, where he refers to Peter, where he's calling him Satan, and he says, "You're a hindrance to me. You're not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." A couple of things to note there. You see that my translation says hindrance. Yours may say stumbling block or something else like that. We haven't necessarily been calling it out in every case that we go through, but it's interesting to note that Matthew seems to bring up several of these kind of statements that refer to the idea of giving offense or being a stumbling block or being a hindrance. And I won't spend a lot of time making a lot more out of that. But it definitely is interesting when Matthew kind of brings light to these things. We'll see it potentially even later on at the end of chapter 17, where he's going to tell Peter not to give offense to the leaders or the people of that are collecting this tax. And so it's just interesting to think, if you want to just kind of do a side study on your own, is pull out some of those examples and just think about what perhaps implications there might be as Matthew gives us focus on this idea of giving offense versus not giving offense, and when it's called out and when it's addressed. It's just an interesting thing to note on the side. But then also, in this statement, this idea here at the end of it, you're not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man. You know, hear any echoes from anything else in Matthew in that statement? Maybe too obvious, but where have we been talking about that idea?
In chapter 6 and further on, seek ye first the kingdom of God, as well as the idea of seeking God and not mammon.
Exactly.
So those are the two things I think of.
Yeah. So again, just another example, and we'll continue to note these as we go through here, but just how many different ways and how many different times the teaching in the Sermon on the Mount comes back up and manifests itself in the other instructions and the other things that are called for throughout the rest of this document. It's just really, I mean, it's hard to overstate how foundational that is to the rest of what comes after that. And so, you know, in Matthew's account, at least, Jesus continues on from that statement and talks about the cross that they would have to bear. John, did you have a comment or a follow-up on that?
Well, one other observation about the wording that Jesus uses here toward Peter is interesting to me. I'm not sure how intentional it is, but at least it's interesting. But, you know, he says, "Get thee behind me, Satan." And what Peter has just said is, you know, the route that Jesus is planning to save the world through by going to the cross, that Peter doesn't want him to go through that. And maybe Peter's still thinking that Jesus is going to be an earthly king, so he can't die and be an earthly king. But nonetheless, he's not wanting Jesus to go through the route to the cross. And the last time we saw this was in chapter 4, when Satan tempted Jesus 3 times. And the third temptation was, if you'll bow down and worship me, you know, I will give you all these kingdoms. And what Satan was offering was a shortcut to the kingship. You know, he said, I can give you these kingdoms directly if you'll bow down and worship me, and you won't have to go to the cross. And so now Jesus is trying to emphasize to them, I've got to go to the cross. And Peter says, you know, it shall never be, you know, you can't go to the cross. And so he's actually parroting the same words of Satan, is that, you know, I'm saying you're not going to go to the cross. Well, I think that's why Jesus says, get behind me, Satan, is that inadvertently, maybe Peter has basically quoted Satan in trying to give Jesus a route to kingship apart from having to go through the cross. And you know, Satan left Jesus when Jesus rebuked him and told him to get hence, but he comes back again, you know, and he tries, and not directly, but he tries to do it through Peter, one of Jesus' closest associates. And I think that Satan works through us that way as well. You know, he can take somebody that's very godly, someone that's very close to us, and use them very innocently on their part to put a stumbling block or a snare in front of us. And so it's just, I think of 2 Corinthians 2:11, where Jesus says that we are not ignorant, not Jesus, but Paul says we are not ignorant of the devices of Satan. You know, he has so many different tricks up his sleeve, and we need to be aware of them and be looking for them, because sometimes he will use people that are very close to us to try to pull us away from Jesus. But anyway, just some observations there.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's a really important note, right? Is that so often we're most influenced by those that we trust, right? And those that we put in our circle. You know, we see this even in just purely secular matters, whether it's politics or something else, right? We put our stock in the people that are close to us, and they have a huge influence on us. But if we're not checking that those things that we're hearing are in fact true and consistent, then the impact that they can have on us is sometimes stronger than when we're just kind of hit in the face with evil or lies or things like that. Sometimes we can, you know, better resist it when it's obvious and confrontational, but when it comes in, you know, quietly through the suggestion of someone that's close to us, it becomes more of a challenge. And sometimes I think about this statement even in the context of Jesus's prayer in the garden before he's crucified, right? As he's praying for there to be some other way. You know, it's easy to think about, at least in my personal life, how statements like this make it more challenging in a situation like that, where you know that you've got to go this path, you've got to go this road, you know this is the right way that you're doing it, but you're tempted and you're struggling with that, and there's someone else over here telling you, no, that's not the way that you have to go. There's another way here. There's another path. You don't have to make this choice. You don't have to be as committed to this. You don't have to be as devoted to that, right? And it tests us, not just in an obvious, is this correct or not kind of way, but even on an emotional level in many respects. You get a sense of that perhaps even with Job and his trials, and the friends that come and the advice that he gets, and thinking about how those things can emotionally impact our resolve and our commitment to Jesus, or to God's will, as well when we face those challenges.
And like you said, it is God's way, or the way he wants you to go that path, and that leads you into verse 24 and following.
Exactly. Yeah. So he goes on then and talks about bearing this cross. And as we talked about in Mark, it's important for us to appreciate that when he's talking about the cross here, it doesn't have the connotation of Jesus' sacrifice on the cross that is perhaps more instantaneous in our minds, because we connect the cross with Jesus in that way. And it's not that it means something fundamentally different, but if you're sitting here and you're listening to these things and you're struggling with understanding, and Jesus stands in front of you and talks about, you've got to take up this instrument of death. For lack of a better understanding, that's what the cross is, right? You've got to take up this instrument of death. You've got to bear and carry the instrument that will bring about your own death, right? And that's exactly what he's calling them to do. Deny yourself, take this up. Whoever would lose his life for my sake will find it. And so, sometimes you see these statements in scripture, and it, like I said, we've talked about this a little bit before, it just challenges you to see, like, how do these two things coexist? You've got Jesus in Matthew 11 talking about how his yoke is light and his burden is easy. And over here, he's saying, pick up your cross and die, right? And thinking about how those two statements coexist is important for us, I think, as we wrestle with our own faith. Here, the emphasis is on the fact that the things that we would want to hang on to, right, the things that we would attach ourselves to, have to be put away, have to give up these things. If a man profits, what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? All these things that we would attach ourselves to and give ourselves to have to be given up. A man can't give anything in return for his soul. And so verse 27, for the Son of Man is going to come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and he will repay each according to what he has done. And truly there are some of you standing here who will see this when the Son of Man comes in his kingdom. So this statement of faith that that Peter has declared when Jesus asked this question, Jesus has now taken that statement of faith and transitioned it into this call to, now you've got to really understand what this is going to mean and require of you. You've got the faith, you've got the understanding. Now let's open the door and see what this is really going to need from you, the kind of commitment that you're going to have to follow through this, to deny yourself and to take up his cross and to do these things in following me. And so, that point about how we walk in the steps of Jesus, right? There are certainly things that we may not have to bear, but in many respects, right, we are committing ourselves to go to the same extent on this earth that Jesus did. Certainly he's talking in the context of his disciples, and there's some other contextual things to think about as it relates to judgment and whatnot in terms of what he's saying here. But we recognize the larger call of the commitment that's going to require us, that we would bear the very thing that would account for our death. We would bear that and deny ourselves in order to gain our life. Other comments you want to add to that? So it's interesting, in chapter 17, we see in verse 1 something that we don't get a whole lot of in Matthew, and that's a reference to time. We haven't talked about it as much in our study here, but it's often noted how Matthew doesn't stick consistently to a sequential, chronological order of things, but yet here's an example of where Matthew is giving us a time reference. And I think, we could maybe put a couple of different reasons out, but I think perhaps the reason for that statement here is to help us appreciate how much it is in response to the things that have happened in chapter 16, right? We see that this transfiguration that we're told about here with Peter, James, and John going up on the mountain, we see and appreciate, I think, that this is coming right on the heels of this confession and this statement that Jesus is going to make. And so we see that it's in response to that, or strongly connected with those things. And so as we looked at before in Mark's account, right, they're taken up there, they see Elijah, or they see Moses and Elijah, these figures who give us this sense of what is to come in the Old Testament, and give us this kind of type of Christ. They're with Jesus now. The impact of that from an understanding of the law and the writings of the prophets is hugely significant, right? When we think about in Deuteronomy that there is going to be one to come like Moses, right? When we think about the role that Elijah has in declaring the way, these statements, these promises from the law and the writings and the prophets are all tied up in what we're seeing here. And so that's where having that understanding of those helps us appreciate the significance of what is seen. But he's transfigured, his face shines, his clothes become light. You see God, as we talked about in Mark, this time, instead of just saying, "This is my beloved son in whom I am well pleased," he directs Peter, James, and John to listen to him. Give ear to these things, give heed to these things, because he is who he is and what he is bringing about. And Jesus, as they fall on their faces, not understanding this, terrified presumably, he tells them to rise and have no fear. And when they lifted up their eyes, they saw no one but Jesus only. And again, there's so much that we could draw from that, but just even that picture of the only way that Peter, James, and John knew how to respond to this ultimately was to fall and be terrified for what they saw. But yet you see Jesus reaching out and tell them there's no reason to fear, right? That picture in terms of what God is wanting to do with us is so embodied in just that one example, where all we know how to do is to be terrified and to cower and to fall on our face. And yet Jesus is saying, you can stand and rise and have no fear. And so I hope that picture of what Jesus is doing, that picture of what is promised and laid in store for us kind of sticks for that reason, to appreciate the significance of it. And as Jesus comes down the mountain, then, of course, what does he want them to do now that they've seen and understood all these things? Yeah, John put his finger over his hand. Don't tell anyone, right? Don't tell anyone. And ultimately, what I think we see in that statement and others like it is that what Jesus was intently focused on right now was on preparing those who were going to carry forward the message. And we've talked about this, I think, in our Mark study. Jesus's intent was not to carry that message to all people himself. His intent from the start, his plan was from the start, was to prepare people who would carry that message and relay that on. You read Paul's statement of that to Timothy, where he tells him to entrust these things to faithful men who will entrust it to others also. And as we tie in some of these thoughts that we've been focused on the last 3 years about God's work and God's purpose and his desire to use others, to use us in the carrying out of his purpose, his choosing to use us, even though he could have done it himself, even though he could have spent as long as he wanted on this earth carrying that message, God chose to use us. And so he tells Peter, James, and John, the time's not right. Don't tell anyone what you've seen until the Son of Man is raised from the dead. And you see them struggling, and they're asking these questions, and what about Elijah? And, in verse 12, understand that the Elijah has come. And the people couldn't see it, right? And even when Elijah was there in front of them, they couldn't see it. Perhaps you could say that by implication, what he's pointing out is that even with the Son of Man in front of them, they can't see it. Just like they couldn't see it with John the Baptist and how he was Elijah, they're not going to see it as the Son of Man. But appreciate the significance of his death and his sacrifice in that timing. It's not just a matter of the time not being right until his death and sacrifice. It's his sacrifice, death, and resurrection that will help them see what they can't see with Jesus standing right in front of them. They have him with them, but they can't see. They had John with them and they couldn't see that he's Elijah. But when his death and his resurrection are fulfilled, then the time is right. And so at the end of this, right, they understand now finally that he was speaking as John the Baptist of the one. And you start to see the gears perhaps clicking a little bit in terms of the understanding of who it is they're talking to and what's going on here. Other observations or questions on that encounter?
I find it interesting there in verse 6, of course, when they fell on their faces to the ground, of course, prostrate. And it seems like that's quite a contrast from a lot of folks you hear today. I remember a few years ago, there was this Baptist preacher wrote a book. I think his name was John Piper. He wrote a book where he was 60 minutes in heaven or something, where he died and went to heaven and saw all these things. But, you know, and it's quite a contrast because, you know, if I would have went up there before the Lord, I would have fell down before him. Maybe not out of fear so much, but at least out of reverence. But yet the comparison here is, you know, these people having out of body experiences, telling what they're doing, you know, seeing relatives or whatever. Well, you know, it's not quite the same as like the disciples here hearing God speak from out of a cloud and hitting the deck, you know, either out of fear or reverence, but here we see out of fear.
Right.
So at least a godly fear there. So, and it seems again, Jesus reinforces him about dying and raising from the dead. 6 days later from when he just spoke about, he reinforces that teaching once again. And I still don't think they quite get it. Of course, we know.
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, as we close out this chapter here in the last couple of minutes, right, we see another example, another question of faithfulness come up in the healing of this boy with the demon. You know, the man comes out to Jesus and, you know, asks for him to heal them. Your disciples can't heal him, and Jesus turns and remarks on the faithlessness, right? And we see this exchange about the littleness of their faith in terms of what they're asking for, and Jesus emphasizing that even this faith of the mustard seed, right, could result in these things. And that echoes, I think, in part again from the Sermon on the Mount about the confidence that we are to have, ask and seek and knock, some of these things. So the faith and the confidence that we're supposed to have with God is brought out here. And then as John mentions, right, now we see the second time where Jesus is talking about what is going to happen, where he's going to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him, and he will be raised on the third day. And I don't know how deliberate, right, that language is in our translation, at least, but this idea of delivered in the hands of men, it's not just a statement about, well, this is, you know, factually what's going to happen, right? But Jesus, this king that they've been looking for, is going to submit himself to the control of men. They're going to kill him, and then he'll be raised. And we see the response is they're greatly distressed, right? And in some sense, we might say, well, that's a step better than being in complete denial about it. You know, I'm not sure that's intentionally what's meant by that, but they're greatly distressed as they're trying to process these things and understand what's going on. And what does this mean? And then finally, you know, we won't have time, but to look at the temple tax question here. Jesus starts to, or not starts, but he goes back to this idea. Really, the focus in this example, I think, as he responds to this question, is about that distinction again between things of the earth and things of God, in helping his followers distinguish between the two and make that separation. And so that's where the question comes from when he says in here about the kings. From whom do the kings of the earth toll or tax? From their sons or their others, right? Well, the kings don't tax their own family members. They tax others, the people who aren't part of their family. And so Jesus said to him, you know, when he responds that, yeah, it's the others that they tax, then the sons are free of it. Again, there's several implications here that we won't have time for, but just appreciate how Jesus is making this distinction between the things of this earth and the people of this earth, and the things of God and the people of this God, and trying to use this example to make that distinction. And the reason why I wanted to just squeeze that in, even though we don't have time to really go in depth into it, is that along with the things that we've read here since Peter's makes this statement, set the scene for what we're going to dig into on Sunday here in chapter 18. Now that they've been, come to some understanding that Jesus is the Christ, right? And that he is the one that they're to be looking for and anticipating. Jesus is trying to take that faith that they have, that understanding that they have, and turn that into a more complete understanding of what their role is going to look like in the kingdom, and ultimately what all citizens of the kingdom are going to have to live like. And so this entire chapter in verse 18, I think, is intended to challenge the ideas that people would have come, the misconceptions. Now that we've understood, now that we've challenged what the Messiah is going to look like, now that we've challenged what the kingdom itself is going to look like, now we've got to challenge what it looks like to be one or a part of this kingdom. And so these questions about the greatest, who are they, and ultimately leading up into this parable of the unforgiving servant, all of those things are meant to challenge this conception that one would have about what it means to be in the kingdom, not just who the king is, or not just the nature of the kingdom, but what does it mean to be in the kingdom, get challenged when he throws out these ideas and challenges them with these ideas about the roles that we have, the relationships that we have with one another, and the ultimately the humility and the attitude of deference that we are to have with one another. And so all of those statements in chapter 18, I think, as we walk through that on Sunday, we'll see are continuing this focus that Jesus has on now helping his disciples, now preparing them for the work that they're going to have to come after his death and resurrection, preparing them to have the right attitude and the right heart and mentality to take that work forward. So that's what we'll be digging through on Sunday, Lord willing. Anything else for our class we want to share tonight?
As I'm looking at the verses that we've gone through tonight, I think a lot about how people in Jesus' closest circle were wrong about a whole bunch of stuff. And it makes me think about, I think it's easy with as many resources as we have, commentaries, study guides, study Bibles, audio sermons, all that stuff, all of which is really great. I think we're in danger sometimes of thinking because we have XYZ resources, therefore we have all the answers. And this is just a reminder that we need to have humility and openness when we come to the text. One, that we could be wrong about whatever issue it is, but also just we're not going to have all the answers.
Yeah, it's a constant life of growth that we have to commit ourselves and maturing to. Anything else? All right, well, we will punch over to the other link for announcements, and we'll see you all, Lord willing, on Sunday.
Thanks.